Hey guys, I'm going to teach you all about absolute value equations. By the end of this lesson, you'll be able to set up and solve absolute value equations. So go ahead and get out your binder, turn to the math section, and let's go ahead and take some notes. So the first thing we want to do is actually define absolute value. What do you think or remember about absolute value in your own words? You should remember that absolute value is the distance a number is from zero on the number line without considering direction. So the absolute value of both -5 and 5 would be 5. It's always a positive number or zero. So in our first example, what could x equal? X could be 3 because the absolute value of 3 is 3, or x could equal -3 because the absolute value of -3 would be 3. When you look at an equation within the absolute value like this, you want to consider that what's in that absolute value could end up being 5, as you can see here. But also, because of the absolute value, it could equal -5 because the absolute value of -5 is 5. When you're solving absolute value equations like this one, you want to actually set up both cases. Because it's in the absolute value, 2x plus 3 could equal 5, or, and this is the important part, it could equal -5 because the absolute value would end up making it +5 anyway. So you want to set up the equation like this. It's the same thing as 2x plus 3. You have to set it to a -5. We do that so we can solve both equations and then find all solutions to the absolute value equation. Start by solving for x in the positive case. Press play when you're ready to check. You should get x equals 1. Let's plug that in to check. 2 times 1 is 2. 2 plus 3 is 5. And the absolute value of 5 is 5. Since 5 equals 5, we solved this first equation correctly. We solved the second equation doing the same steps. We'd still subtract 3 first. The only difference is -5 minus 3 is -8. Now we'd still divide by 2 from both sides. So the other solution is x equals -4. Let's test that solution into the absolute value equation. -4 times 2 is -8. -8 plus 3 is -5. And the absolute value of -5 is 5. 5 equals 5, so we know that we've done this equation correctly. When you solve absolute value equations, you'll always get two solutions. X equals 1 in this case, or x equals -4. The way that we get those two solutions is to isolate the absolute value expression, set up the two equations, one for the positive value, one for the negative, and then we would solve both equations for x. The only time when you wouldn't have two solutions is whenever you have something like this where it's set equal to 0. The only thing that you can put in would be 0. In that case, there'd be one solution. Or if your absolute value equation was set to a negative number. In that case, there's no solution because absolute value should always make that value positive. Let's get back to example 3 and let's start it out. What would be my first step? Since the absolute value expression is already isolated, we move on and set up the two equations, one for the positive value and one for the negative. Next, you need to solve both equations. What are the solutions to these equations? You should get x equals 4 or x equals -14. For example 4, it's the exact same thing. Even though the 3 is on the other side, you still want to set up your two cases. One equals -3 and one equals +3. Go ahead and try this example all by yourself and press play when you're ready to check. After setting each equation equal to the positive case and the negative case, you would subtract 7 and divide by 2 to get x equals -2 or x equals -5. Before we look at the next example, let's look at our steps. Step 1 is to isolate the absolute value expression first. In all the examples so far, the absolute value part has already been isolated, except for in example 5. To get the absolute value of x minus 1 by itself, you have to get rid of the plus 17. So you should subtract 17 from both sides. And now the absolute value part of the expression is isolated. You do that so you can clearly see what it equals, and you can correctly set up the two cases. X minus 1 could equal +6, or x minus 1 could equal -6. Only what's in the absolute value could be negative. That's why we wanted to isolate it before we start determining the solutions. So what are the solutions in this absolute value equation? It could be x equals 7 or x equals -5. If you're not sure if you did it right, you could always plug those values into the x to check. We need to do the same thing for example 6. Let's start by isolating the absolute value part of this equation. To do that, we need to get rid of this times 3. So you would have to divide both sides by 3 before you set up your positive and negative cases. Now, one thing I want to warn you about, sometimes people think, oh, when a 3 is next to parentheses, I multiply it out and distribute. However, these are not parentheses. These are absolute value signs. So let's just remember our steps and isolate the absolute value expression before you can begin solving. What are the two solutions for this absolute value equation? X could equal 5 or x could equal -21. Let's look at example 7. What's the first step to solving this absolute value equation? The very first step is going to be to isolate the absolute value part. So we need to divide both sides by 16, just like we divided by 3 here. What do you see as the problem right now? Hopefully you realize that the problem is that we have an absolute value on this side, and somehow it's going to end up equaling a negative number. That can't be the case because as we defined, absolute value represents the distance a number is from 0, and it's always a positive. So if it comes out to equal a negative number, that means that there is no solution. Even if you plugged in a number like 3 and you put that in here and 3 minus 5 is negative 2, the absolute value of negative 2 is still going to be positive 2. So if you see absolute value and it equals a negative number, that just means that there is no solution. However, that does not mean that the example 8 has no solution. That's because the absolute value part is not isolated yet. You have to have it isolated before you can determine how many solutions it has. So let's do our first step. How do we get rid of that divide by negative 2? You would multiply by negative 2 to both sides. When you do that, a negative 6 times a negative 2 is a positive 12. Now we can set our two cases and solve. Sorry, that positive case should be a positive 12. And the two solutions could be x equals 13 or x could be negative 11. Now look at number 9. We see two things in the way of getting the absolute value isolated. You see a plus 8 and you see this times 5. We need to get rid of them just like you would solve an equation. First, subtract 8 from both sides, then divide both sides by 5. Now the absolute value is isolated and you can set up your two cases. X could be 13 or x could be negative 5. And that's it. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, please let me know. Bye!